B.F. Skinner, the man who not only thought outside the box, but literally built one. Burrhus Frederick Skinner. Yes, that guy. The one who trained pigeons to play ping pong and made behaviorism famous. Get comfortable because this is going to be a real psychological lullaby. Once upon a time, in the small and modest town of Susquehanna, Pennsylvania, a baby was born in 1904 and was condemned with the name of Burrhus Frederick Skinner. Yes, Burrhus. It sounds like a sneeze, and a burp had a child. But young Burrhus, or BF, as the world would later call him, thank God for the initials, would become one of the most influential and misunderstood psychologists of the 20th century. Skinner was not always a psychology genius. He started as a literary man, with a degree in English and the dream of becoming the next Hemingway, or perhaps Melville, but with more rats and fewer tearful metaphors. He even built a corner to write in the attic of his parents and wrote pages and pages of fiction. Unfortunately, the publishers were not impressed. His characters lacked complexity, according to critics. The irony: Skinner later stripped psychology of its internal complexity, focusing on observable behavior rather than the subconscious dreams that Freud had that week. After abandoning literature, Skinner opted for psychology. The works of John B. Watson and Ivan Pavlov lit the spark in him. No mystical souls, no endless interpretations of dreams, just observable actions and the consequences that shape them. He enrolled at Harvard and, as usual, began to reshape the future of the science of behavior between classes and lunches in the cafeteria. At Harvard, Skinner created his now famous contraption, the operant conditioning chamber, affectionately nicknamed the Skinner box. Imagine a small enclosure with a lever or a button and a food dispenser. Something like a Las Vegas slot machine for rats. If you press the lever, you get a food pellet. If you don't press the lever, you don't get anything. If you occasionally press the wrong lever, you receive a slight electric shock. It was basic, brutal, and brilliant science. The principle was simple. Behavior is a function of its consequences. He called it operant conditioning, reinforcement, whether positive, adding something pleasant, or negative, removing something unpleasant, increases the probability of a behavior occurring. Punishment, on the other hand, decreases it. And let's be honest, that's more or less the model we follow to educate dogs, children, employees, and ourselves. Skinner was not satisfied with training rats. He focused his attention on birds, on pigeons, to be exact. He taught them to peck keys, spin in circles, and, yes, play ping pong. He even worked on Project Pigeon, a World War II plan to use pigeon-guided missiles. It never got to fly, but Skinner insisted that the birds were more accurate than the military technology of the time. Attention, drones, here come the war pigeons. Skinner took these findings and applied them to human behavior. He saw no real difference between a child learning to say please and a rat learning to press a lever. For him, everything was stimulus and response shaped by reinforcement schedules. And of those schedules, he had a whole taxonomy. Fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, variable interval. Have you ever wondered why slot machines are so addictive? It's the variable ratio reinforcement. Little did Skinner know the game before Las Vegas. His vision of the world culminated in the controversial but influential book Beyond Freedom and Dignity. In it, he argued that our cherished notions of free will and moral responsibility were illusions. People are a product of their environment. If you change the environment, you change behavior. Predictable and programmable. The philosophers were stunned. The ethics specialists were breathless. But Skinner simply shrugged and tweaked his program. And then there was the air crib, a misunderstood invention designed to make child raising more efficient. Think of it as a tech crib, with controlled temperature, padded, and easy cleaning. The media went wild. Scientist raises baby in a box, they shouted. It was not a psychological experiment, but rather a practical engineering solution to the challenges of raising children. Skinner wanted to create a safer, more comfortable, hygienic environment for his daughter, Deborah. The crib maintained a constant temperature and humidity, which eliminated the need for heavy blankets that posed a suffocation risk, and it had a large transparent window so the baby could see the outside and the parents could observe them. The goal was to reduce the workload of the parents, wash less clothes, change less diapers, and increase the comfort of the baby. It was misinterpreted by the public and media, who confused it with Skinner's boxes for animals. But in reality, the air crib was one of the first attempts at technology-assisted parenting. Partly science, partly innovation, and definitely not an experiment with children. Skinner also had utopian ideas. His novel, Walden 2, imagined a society based on behavioral principles. A community without crime, chaos, or free will. Only a designed environment that guaranteed harmony through reinforcement. Critics called it eerie. Supporters called it visionary. Skinner called it project. He was prolific and wrote articles, lectures, and books. He influenced education. Think of token economies and reward charts, businesses, incentive systems and management, and even child rearing. His work led to applied behavioral analysis, ABA, now a cornerstone of autism therapy. Every time someone says, catch them doing something good, they are channeling Skinner. But he faced criticism. Humanists like Carl Rogers considered Skinner's vision of humanity to be a bit somber. No inner life, no emotions, just behavior and environment. Rogers defended empathy and unconditional positive regard. Skinner responded with data, lots of data, graphs, levers, and rats. Despite the drama, Skinner never faltered. He stayed at Harvard advising students, perfecting theories, and, at times, angering philosophers. He received a lot of awards, including the first Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Psychological Association, which he accepted a few days before his death in 1990. His influence is everywhere. In classrooms, where teachers use behavior charts, in apps that reward streaks, in health plans that offer incentives, even in your refrigerator, which beeps when you leave it open. Skinner's invisible hand is always pushing, reinforcing, shaping. So the next time you give your dog a treat, turn off the alarm, or reward yourself with a brownie for finishing a spreadsheet, remember that you're not just living. You are operantly conditioning. Good night, dear dreamer. May your reinforcements be abundant, your punishments mild, and extinction streaks brief. Jean Piaget, the man who watched children play and saw the architecture of the human mind. Grab your blanket and get ready to let go as we explore the curious case of the Swiss watchmaker of developmental psychology. Once upon a time, in 1896, in Neuchâtel, Switzerland, a boy named Jean Piaget was born. A boy who would someday make it acceptable to say things like assimilation and equilibrium in preschool curricula. Neuchâtel, a city more famous for watchmaking than human development, may have awakened in Piaget a fascination with the functioning of systems, whether they worked or thought. A true child prodigy, Piaget published his first article on an albino sparrow at the age of 10. That is that. While other children were still learning to play hopscotch, Jean was immersed in ornithological knowledge and biological jargon. If your child bothers you with dinosaur facts, be thankful he doesn't send articles to journals. However, PJ's childhood was intellectual, intense, and emotionally mature. His father was a historian and professor who encouraged independent thought. His mother was not a stabilizing influence. In fact, Pia would later say that she suffered from mental health problems that contributed to her son's introspective and analytical nature. In psychology, this is often known as character formation. He studied natural sciences at the University of Neuchâtel and obtained his doctorate in biology at 22 years old. That could have been it. But fate and a temporary job in Paris had different plans. While working with Alfred Binn's team on standardizing IQ tests, Pia noticed something strange for children. Children didn't just make mistakes. They made the same kind of mistakes over and over again at predictable ages. For most administrators, that would have been a statistical oddity. But Pia saw a pattern. He didn't just want to know what children did wrong. He wanted to know why. This revelation was the birth of his mission, to understand how children construct knowledge. He believed that children are not miniature adults. They are little scientists, busy experimenting, observing, and making sense of their world in real time. They don't absorb knowledge like sponges. They build it piece by piece, messily. And so began the Piagetian revolution. Let's talk about stages. PJ proposed for, each of which marks a different type of cognitive ability. Sensoromotor stage, from 0 to 2 years. Babies explore the world through their senses and actions. Object permanence. Here arises the knowledge that things continue to exist even if they are hidden. The peekaboo game is not just pretty. It's mind-blowing science for babies. Pre-operational stage, from 2 to 7 years. Language, imagination, and some entertaining logical gaps appear. Ekokentrismpeaks. You know, when your child thinks hiding his face makes him invisible. Also the conservation tasks. Forget it. Pour the same water into a taller glass, and they will swear there is more. Always. Concrete operational stage, from 7 to 11 years. Children finally understand logic, reversibility, and cause and effect. They can pass conservation tests, classify objects according to criteria, and understand that appearances can be deceiving. Basically, they start to be tolerable in games. Formal operational stage, from 12 years onwards. Abstract thinking, hypothetical scenarios, and deductive reasoning appear. Teenagers begin to philosophize, question systems, and form opinions about things they have read. The downside: endless existential debates about whether we exist. PJ introduced key concepts such as schemes, assimilation, and accommodation. A scheme is a mental structure for understanding world. When we find something new, we fit it into an existing assimilation scheme or adjust our scheme to accommodate the new information. It is like updating your brain's software, except that your brain does it without asking permission. One of Piaget's most audacious ideas was equilibration, the process of achieving a balance between assimilation and accommodation. This is what drives development onward. Imbalance or cognitive discomfort motivates us to resolve this mismatch. In short, confusion is what makes us grow up. So, next time you feel bewildered, thank your brain for the update. And no, he did not come up with all of this in an ivory tower. Piaget was in the trenches observing children meticulously, often his own 3 children. He took notes carefully. He asked questions often. He tested his hypotheses. He probably saw more block towers than any Lego engineer, and his findings became a cornerstone of developmental psychology. His ideas revolutionized all education. Suddenly, teachers were talking about preparation, discovery, learning, and developmentally appropriate practices. Piaget said, "You cannot accelerate cognitive development. No matter how many flashcards you teach a child, they will not understand abstract algebra until their brain is ready." It is biology, not poor parenting. His influence extended into other disciplines: education, philosophy, artificial intelligence, even AI. Computer scientists in the 60s and 70s studied Piaget's work to better understand how humans process information, to build machines that could one day do the same. So, if you're listening to this on a smart speaker, take your hat off to Jean Piaget. Of course, he had some detractors. Some argued that his stages were too rigid, that cultural context played a more important role than he admitted, and that children are capable of more if asked correctly. Later researchers, such as Lev Vygotsky, emphasized the importance of social interaction. But Piaget was not at all dogmatic. He welcomed criticism, collaboration, and refinement of his ideas. He considered his work a frame of reference, not a definitive answer. Throughout a career that spanned over 6 decades, Piaget published more than 60 books and hundreds of articles. He received honorary degrees from universities all around the world. He founded the International Center for Genetic Epistemology in Geneva, which became a center for pioneering research in child psychology. Jean Piaget passed away in 1980 at the age of 84. He left a legacy of curiosity, rigor, and radical respect for children's cognitive life. He reminded us that childhood is not just a waiting room for adulthood. It is a universe in itself, worthy of study, respect, and wonder. So tonight, as you immerse yourself in your own subconscious exploration, imagine Jean Piaget with his notebook, smiling silently as a small child fails for the 5th time on a conservation task. Because in that moment of confusion, real learning is taking place. Sleep well, dear dreamer, and remember that like knowledge, dreams are also built. And one is never too old to build another scheme. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, the man who made you wonder if wanting to marry your mother was normal. Lie down and let neurosis invade you as we explore the dark, cigar smoke-filled corridors of your mind. In the Freudian tradition, once upon a time, in 1856, in the bustling town of Freiburg, in the Austrian Empire, today Freiburg, Czech Republic, a boy named Sigismund Shlomo Freud was born. Yes, that was really his name. Wisely, he omitted the Sigismund Shlomo part because he was destined to write about the most intimate and controversial aspects of the human psyche. And a name should not be such a big obstacle. Young Freud was a brilliant student, fluent in many languages and fascinated by the mysteries of the human condition. His family moved to Vienna when he was 4 years old, and that city would become his intellectual and emotional home for most of his life. As a young man, he turned his gaze inward and outward, obsessed with what lay hidden beneath human thought and action. Freud studied medicine at the University of Vienna, specializing in the field of neurology. During those early years, he worked extensively with patients suffering from what was then known as hysteria, especially women who showed seemingly inexplicable symptoms. The standard medical model offered no answers. But Freud had a strong hunch. Perhaps the problem wasn't the body. Perhaps it was the mind itself. Cocaine. In the late 19th century, it was still legal, and Freud dove right in. He thought it could be a wonder drug. He prescribed it liberally and even used some himself. In retrospect, it was not his most lasting legacy, but it gave him confidence to explore new psychological frontiers. It was like Red Bull for Victorian intellectuals. After spending time with Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris, who hypnotized people to enter and exit their neuroses, Freud returned to Vienna convinced that the deepest layers of the mind could be accessed. But instead of hypnosis, Freud began something new. He told his patients to lie on a couch and just talk whatever came to mind. He called it free association, and from those ramblings, he believed unconscious truth would emerge. At the heart of Freud's theory was the idea that we do not fully own our own minds. Most of what we think, feel, and do is driven by unconscious desires, especially those we would prefer not to admit. According to Freud, repression wasn't just forgetting. It was a psychic doorman pushing uncomfortable truths into the basement of the mind. He proposed the now iconic structure of the psyche: the ID, the ego, and superego. The ID represents our primary, instinctive impulses. It works according to the pleasure principle. It wants what it wants, and it wants it now. It is like a small child with a sugar rush demanding the satisfaction of basic needs such as food, rest, and instinctive impulses, among which Freud originally included sex. But we can generalize here to include emotional intimacy or the pursuit of pleasure in general. The superego is the internalized voice of society, culture, and parental expectations. It pleads, corrects, and scolds. It's what makes you feel guilty when you skip the gym or lie on your tax return. Freud saw it as the moral compass formed through one's upbringing. The ego is the realistic mediator. It tries to balance the desires of the ID and the restrictions of the superego. It is responsible for rational thought, planning, and self-control. It is like a skilled diplomat trying to negotiate between a wild child and a strict parent. To manage this inner chaos, Freud identified a series of defense mechanisms. These include repression itself. This is the basis for all defense mechanisms. Repression expels distressing thoughts, memories, or impulses from consciousness. It's not just about simple forgetting. It is the mind actively keeping certain contents hidden because they are too painful, threatening, or socially unacceptable to deal with directly. For example, a person who has experienced a traumatic event in childhood may have no conscious memory of it, but the emotional residue can still determine their behavior and relationships. Projection. This occurs when a person attributes their own unwanted feelings or thoughts to another person. Instead of acknowledging your jealousy, you accuse your partner of being jealous. It is a psychological twist, denying parts of yourself by locating them in others. Displacement. The redirection of an impulse, usually aggression or frustration, from a threatening target toward a safer one. You can't express your anger at your boss. You download it with your roommate, your pet, or your recycling bin. The feeling remains, but the objective shifts. Sublimation. Considered one of the healthiest defense mechanisms, sublimation consists of channeling intense or unacceptable emotional impulses toward constructive and socially valued activities. A person with strong aggressive impulses could become a surgeon, athlete, or a sculptor. Someone with overwhelming sadness could pour it into poetry or music. Instead of repressing energy, sublimation redirects it to something productive and creative. Thank you, ego. It is not just an arbitrator between the ID and superego. It is also an artist, a strategist, and sometimes a commitment magician. And of course, there's the infamous Oedipus complex. Freud suggested that during the phallic stage of development, between 3 and 6 years old, children develop unconscious sexual desires towards their mothers and hostility towards their fathers. Girls, in his original vision, suffered from penis envy and a variant complex that he never clearly defined, meaning he was totally wrong. Modern psychology has taken several steps back with respect to this theory, but Freud insisted it was the core of identity development. His dream theory was equally controversial. In the interpretation of dreams, from 1900, Freud stated that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious. Each dream had a manifest content, what happened, and a latent content, what it really meant. And the latent content used to be about sex, repressed traumas, or unresolved problems with their father. Despite his very controversial ideas, Freud revolutionized therapy. The psychoanalytic method became the gold standard for decades. He created the framework for talk therapies. The therapist as a neutral presence who listens. The patient on a couch, exploring his own mind. It was therapy as excavation, digging into dreams, slips, Freudian slips, and defenses to find the hidden treasure of truth. Among his early followers were Carl Jung and Alfred Adler, among others. But, like any rock band, they ended up separating because of creative differences. Jung wanted to explore myths and the collective unconscious. Adler focused more on power and social forces. Freud stayed with the libido, repression, and the death instinct. You know, the classic topic for dinner. He was also very prolific. Among his most important works is Civilization and its Discontents, where he argued that society forces us to repress our desires, creating internal tension. He believed that human beings are driven by two primary forces: love, creation, and death, destruction. According to Freud, the history of humanity is a tragic and comic struggle between these forces. Freud spent his last years battling jaw cancer, a consequence of his lifelong habit of smoking cigars, but he never gave it up. After fleeing Nazi-occupied Austria in 1938, he settled in London, where he died in 1939. He underwent more than 30 operations, but never stopped working, writing, or thinking because, of course, the unconscious never sleeps. Today, Freud is more a cultural icon than a clinical tool. Most therapists no longer use pure psychoanalysis. It is expensive, time-consuming, and relies heavily on dream journaling. But his legacy lives on. We talk about the unconscious. We analyze dreams. We joke about our Freudian slips. We keep wondering why our romantic lives are a mess. And somewhere, deep in our minds, we hear Freud laughing. So tonight, when you snuggle into bed and dive into the depths of your unconscious, remember that Freud gave us permission to explore the strange, murky, and irrational parts of ourselves. He made the inner life worth investigating. Although he was spectacularly wrong in some ways, he raised questions that still remain important. May you sleep well, dear dreamer. And if you dream of cigars, remember that sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and other times it is not at all. Carl Rogers, a man so compassionate that he could probably make your plans feel heard. Take a deep breath and prepare for a psychological hug with the one and only Mr. Person-Centered Therapy. Once upon a time, in 1902, in the quiet little town of Oak Park, Illinois, a boy named Carl Ransom Rogers was born. That second name, Ransom. Nothing says more about a future therapist than a name that sounds vaguely like a noir detective. But don't be fooled by the name. This man was not here to kidnap your psyche, only to listen with relentless positivity. Rogers was raised in a devout and disciplined Protestant home. Imagine long days, hard work, and little emotional pampering. Naturally, young Carl grew up a bit reserved, deeply introspective, and very interested in agriculture. Yes, agriculture. He began his college career studying plants and soils before making the normal leap to theology. Then, after realizing that he didn't want to save souls as much as understand them, he changed course again, this time toward psychology. Thank goodness. He earned his doctorate from the University of Columbia in 1931 and soon found himself working in the clinical field, trying to help troubled children and adolescents. And this is where the magic begins. While everyone else was busy diagnosing and labeling, Rogers did something revolutionary. He listened, not with a clipboard and a stopwatch, but with empathy, a genuine, unconditional, and non-judgmental presence. Mind-blowing. In a field dominated by people like Freud, Tell Me About Your Mother, and Skinner, Press the Lever, Get the Reward, Rogers introduced a radical idea. People are inherently good. They're not broken, nor are they defective, they're just a little lost. And with the right environment, they can grow and become the best version of themselves, like houseplants. You just have to add empathy, sunlight, and perhaps a touch of positive regard. His main contribution was person-centered therapy. It was originally called client-centered, before client began to sound too much like a legal statement. The idea was simple. The therapist provides 3 basic conditions to foster growth. Empathy, the ability to deeply understand the client's experience. Unconditional positive regard, total acceptance no matter what. Congruence, the therapist is real and authentic, not a Freudian mannequin. In other words, just be a decent human being. The clients were no longer revolutionary patients. They were not sick, broken, or in need of fixing. They were people worthy of respect and capable of finding their own answers if someone shut up and listened to them. This was not therapy. It was a human relationship, and it worked. It really worked. Rogers would sit with his clients, nodding, reflecting their feelings, creating an atmosphere so free of judgment that it could make a confessional envious. It wasn't about giving advice. It wasn't about analysis. It was about trust, about creating a sacred space where someone could say the most unpleasant things out loud without being answered. Okay, and have you tried yoga? Call did not stop there. His ideas extended beyond therapy, reaching education, conflict resolution, and international peace talks. Yes, Carl Rogers aided in Cold War diplomacy, because apparently what world leaders really needed was more empathy and a good heart-to-heart talk. He believed that the same principles that helped his clients in therapy, honesty, acceptance, and empathy, could also help the world heal. And he was not wrong. He wrote books with titles as soft as On Becoming a Person, which sounds like a self-help guide for toasters with feelings, but which actually became a psychology classic. In it, he argued that we all have a concept of ourselves and that mental health stems from aligning our real self with our ideal self. When both are far apart, anxiety appears. When they get closer, growth occurs. That is realization. That is the optimal point at which inner peace can be found. And Rogers really leaned toward the idea of self-realization, becoming the fullest version of oneself, whatever it was. A painter, a poet, a plumber with interpretive dance dreams. The point was that the answers were within oneself. The therapist was not the expert. You were. The therapist was only there to accompany you while you discovered them. Of course, not everyone agreed. The behaviors thought it too soft. The psychoanalysts thought it too naive. The existentialists thought it too optimistic. But Rogers did not care. He believed in people, in their inner strength, in their drive toward fulfillment, and in their ability to heal under the right conditions. He once said, "When I look at the world, I am pessimistic, but when I look at people, I am optimistic." He influenced everything from classroom dynamics to business management. trainers and teachers began to consider what it meant to create a facilitating environment. His communication model inspired practices in mediation and even raising children. Suddenly, active listening became fashionable. Eye contact, nodding, reflecting what is said. It was not rocket science, but it felt revolutionary. Rogers continued working until an advanced age, continuing to listen, continuing to learn. In fact, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize shortly before his death in 1987. Not bad for a child who once thought he would be a farmer. Today, his ideas endure in therapy rooms, classrooms, mediation circles, and every time someone says, "I hear you," and it makes sense, he reminded us that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is simply to be fully present. So, as you fall asleep tonight, imagine Rogers sitting next to you, nodding empathetically, offering you unconditional positive regard for your most embarrassing thoughts, and assuring you that you, dear listener, are enough. You do not have to earn it. You do not have to prove it. You already are. Sleep well, dear dreamer, and may your inner self feel fully heard. Leon Festinger, the man who showed that human beings are just a bunch of walking contradictions trying to make peace with themselves. So, fluff your pillow and get ready to gently face your dissonance. Once upon a time, in the bustling neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York, a boy was born in 1919 who would one day bother millions of people simply by pointing out that their thoughts often make little sense. His name was Leon Festinger. And if you have ever felt mental unease after making a bad decision, you owe it all to him. Festinger did not initially set out to become a psychologist. His first interests leaned towards science and mathematics, but he finally found his way to psychology through his interest in how people think and behave in real situations. That curiosity led him to the University of Iowa, where he studied with Kurt Lewin, the father of social psychology, while pursuing a doctorate in psychology. Lewin focused on dynamic systems and experimentation in the real world. None of those Freudian theories from an armchair. Festinger adopted that mentality and delved into the chaotic world of human cognition. After serving in the American Army during the Second World War, Festinger worked at the Research Center for Group Dynamics at MIT. Finally, he found his academic home at Stanford, where he would shake the foundations of psychology with a major theory, cognitive dissonance. Let's analyze it. Cognitive dissonance is what happens when your brain holds two contradictory beliefs at the same time. You think you are smart, but you just paid $100 for a plastic gnome for the garden. Ugh. That tension, that psychological discomfort, that is dissonance. Festinger's great intuition was this: people really hate dissonance. We do everything we can to reduce it. Not changing our behavior, no way, but twisting our thoughts to justify it. Have you bought a lemon car? You will convince yourself that it consumes very little fuel. Have you chosen the wrong partner? Well, he recycles and occasionally feeds my cat. According to Festinger, human beings are not logical machines. We are gymnasts of logic, turning around until our beliefs land in the desired place. One of his most famous experiments consisted of boring tasks and lies. Participants were asked to perform a tedious activity, turning pegs on a board for an hour. Yes, that was the entire task. Afterwards, they were asked to tell the next participant that the task had been fun. Some were paid $1 for lying, others $20. The twist: those who received $1 later said they enjoyed the task more than those in the $20 group. Why? The dollar was not justification enough to lie, so they convinced themselves that they liked it. Here is dissonance reduction in action. But that wasn't even Festinger's boldest move. No, that honor goes to his infiltration of an apocalyptic sect in the 1950s. Yes, you heard that right. The sect, led by a woman named Dorothy Martin, believed that the world would end in a great flood on December 21st, 1954. Festinger and his research team posed as believers and infiltrated the group. When the apocalypse did not arrive, as expected, they observed how group members responded. Instead of admitting they were wrong, many doubled down. They said their faith had saved the world. Others insisted that the prophecy had been misinterpreted, that the date was symbolic, or that the flood occurred on a spiritual level. Some even claimed that the group's collective belief had prevented the disaster from happening. In short, they rewrote reality to protect their belief. This study, published in When Prophecy Fails, showed how people resolve dissonance, not by accepting failure, but by reformulating it. The more people had invested in the belief, the more likely they were to justify it. Does that sound familiar? Political fanatics, conspiracy theorists, your uncle on Facebook, they're all classic dissonance managers. Festinger did not stop at dissonance. He also explored social comparison, the idea that we evaluate ourselves by comparing ourselves to others. Festinger argued that we have an innate drive to evaluate our opinions and abilities, but we don't use objective criteria. We use people, and depending on whom we choose, we feel satisfied, dejected, or inspired. Welcome to the psychological roller coaster that is Instagram. He also wrote about informal communication, arguing that rumors and social networks influence opinion more than official sources. This was decades before social networks, but Festinger already saw how people create and maintain belief bubbles. Despite his enormous impact, Festinger was not in favor of disciplinary silos. Later in his career, he moved from psychology to study archaeology and anthropology. He was intrigued by early human beings, how religion formed, and how societies evolved. He was always pursuing big questions. Why do we believe? What moves us? How far will we go to avoid admitting we were wrong? Festinger passed away in 1989, leaving a legacy that has shaped modern psychology, marketing, politics, and internet culture. Although he never got to see TikTok, which is probably for the best, his work is everywhere. Like when you're following a strict celery juice diet and reward yourself with a cookie or three, justify it by saying, well, I deserve it, don't I? Or, it's dark chocolate. It has antioxidants. When you cling to a belief just because it's yours, when you justify a bad decision in the shower, you're living in a Festingerian world. So tonight, as you snuggle into your ethically questionable pajamas that you swore you needed, let the comforting knowledge of Leon Festinger lull you to sleep. Yes, you make contradictory decisions. Yes, you justify them. But everyone does. Sleep well, dear dreamer. And if you wake up not knowing whether your beliefs align with your behavior, don't worry. It's just your brain trying to make peace with itself. Stanley Schachter, the man who discovered why we feel what we feel and why we are less scared when someone else is scared next to us. Get comfortable, because we are about to delve into the emotional landscape of excitement, anxiety, and experimental tricks. Once upon a time, in 1922, in Flushing, New York, a boy named Stanley Schachter was born. When he grew up, he would become one of psychology's most innovative minds. A man who dared to say, hey, maybe we feel emotions because our brain tries to make sense of what our body does. Schachter began by studying art, but found his way into psychology through a deep curiosity for human behavior and a special ability to make the abstract tangible. He served in World War II like many of his peers and, later, studied with the legendary Kurt Lewin at MIT. There he found himself at the epicenter of the new social psychology movement, which focused less on ink blots and more on group dynamics, decision-making, and what people do when they think no one's watching. In 1949, he obtained his doctorate from the University of Michigan and began teaching and experimenting in the history books of psychology. And let's face it, Schachter's most famous work could easily be the plot of a very strange psychological prank show. His most emblematic contribution, the two-factor theory of emotion, was developed with Jerome Singer in the early 1960s. The theory was as follows. Émotion égale physiological arousal plus cognitive interprétation. In other words, your body speeds up and your brain puts a label on it based on the context. Imagine your heart pounding. Are you in love, scared, or angry? According to Schachter, your interpretation depends on the situation. You're not intrinsically anxious or cheerful. Your body is sending an alarm signal, and your mind has to figure out why. To check this, Schachter and Singer did what any responsible researcher would. They lied to their participants. Schachter and Singer carried out an experiment that is now a classic, partly social science and partly theatrical performance. They injected the participants, all of them male university students, with epinephrine, a hormone that increases heart rate and blood pressure, producing a state of physiological arousal. Some participants were correctly informed that the injection would cause these symptoms. Others were misinformed or told nothing. Next, they were led to a room with a supposed fellow participant, actually an accomplice of the researchers, who acted euphorically, laughing, throwing paper airplanes, making silly things, or angrily complaining, hitting objects, and appearing visibly upset. The results proved revealing. Those who did not have a clear explanation for their physical arousal were more likely to adopt the emotional tone of the accomplice. They felt happy when he was happy, irritated when he felt angry. But those who had been told to expect side effects from the injection, like tachycardia, were less influenced. They had an internal explanation and did not seek one in the situation around them. The implication is that emotions are not just about what your body does. They refer to how your brain makes sense of them. When we have doubts, we look to the social context. The emotional signal may begin in the bloodstream, but the interpretation happens in the environment. The conclusion is that people use signals from their environment to interpret their physiological state. If your body is on high alert, your brain scans the room and says, okay, are we feeling joy, rage, or are we just very caffeinated? This concept revolutionized emotion study. It suggested that emotions are not just innate reflexes, but constructed experiences. You don't just feel things, you interpret them sometimes wildly and incorrectly. Thanks, brain. But Shaka did not stop with emotions. He was a master of unexpected psychological twists. In another famous study, Shaka decided to explore the saying, misery loves company, but only certain company. He took the participants to a laboratory and told them that they would receive electric shocks because, apparently, that is how psychologists greet. He told some that the shocks would be mild, others that they would be painful. Then he asked them, would you rather wait alone or with someone else? Guess what? The group with the most anxiety wanted to wait with other people in a similar situation. Misery did not love only company. He loved relevant company. People didn't want distraction. They wanted solidarity. Someone who could confirm that, yes, this whole situation was objectively horrible. Shakar also explored obesity and eating behavior, and proposed that overweight people were more influenced by external signals, such as the time of day or the visibility of food, than by internal hunger signals. Again, the theme is that we are not as aware of what drives our behavior as we think. And then there is social comparison, a field in which Shaka laid the foundations along with Leon Festinger. People look to others to know how to behave, what to believe, and how they feel. We don't just look at ourselves. We also look at everyone else. Do you know that friend who searches for symptoms on Google just to feel better or worse, depending on Reddit threads? Very Shaka. Despite his enormous influence, Shakar was not looking for attention. He was more interested in designing ingenious studies than in fame or media hype. He mentored generations of psychologists and left a model of experimentation as bold as meticulous. He passed away in 1997, but his legacy is present in every introductory psychology book, in every nervous palpitation before a date, in every irrational fight that ends with "I don't even know why I'm crying." If you have ever looked around to figure out how you should feel, thank or blame Stanley Shaka. So tonight, as you immerse yourself in the fuzzy space between wakefulness and sleep, take one deep breath. If your heart races, don't panic. Maybe you're excited. Maybe you're tired. Maybe your brain hasn't found a label yet. Sleep well, my sweet dreamer. And remember, sometimes emotions are just your body asking your brain, what are we feeling? Actually, Neil Elgar Miller, the man who united biology and behavior and taught us that even our most automatic responses can be open to change. So grab your metaphorical lever, set your sleep schedule, and get ready to recondition your night. Once upon a time, in 1909, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a baby named Neil Elgar Miller was born with a middle name that sounded like a Victorian botanist and a last name destined to academia. He grew up in a home steeped in education. His father, Irving Elgar Miller, was a noted psychologist and educator. So yes, psychology ran in the family like Freudian complexes at a Viennese dinner. Young Neil was a curious, reflective, and analytical child who from an early age became interested in how things work, from machines to the mind. He was not satisfied with simple answers. He wanted mechanisms. After obtaining a degree in biology from the University of Washington, he studied at Stanford and then moved to Yale for his doctorate in psychology. At Yale, Miller found a rich intellectual home that fostered interdisciplinary thinking, where rats met reflexes and neurons shook hands with behaviorism. He began to build a career at the intersection of biology and behavior, an unusual and rebellious stance in an era when psychologists were either radical behaviorists like B.F. Skinner or clung to Freudian couches. Miller was not interested in dogmas. He was interested in data. Working alongside John Dollard, Miller co-authored the frustration-aggression hypothesis, a revolutionary theory that suggested that aggression is not just an emotional outburst, but a learned response to the obstruction of goals. The idea was simple but bold. When someone's path to a desired outcome is blocked, whether by a person, a rule, or a circumstance, it produces frustration. That frustration, if unresolved, often leads to aggression. This linked emotional arousal with behavioral consequences in a way that bridged psychoanalytic concepts and learning theory. At that time, this was revolutionary. Psychologists were still divided into sides: those who studied behavior in sterile laboratory settings and those who delved into childhood memories on leather couches. Miller and Dollard tried to merge those worlds. They drew on Freud's theories of internal drives and combined them with operant conditioning. The behaviorist approach focused on observable behavior and reinforcement. They proposed that even deeply ingrained emotional responses, such as aggression, could be modified or reinforced through learning mechanisms. They also introduced the idea of displacement, according to which, if a person cannot discharge their frustration on the original source, for example, a boss, they can redirect it toward a less threatening target, such as shouting at a pet or slamming a door. His work laid the foundation for the study of anger control, conflict resolution, and behavior modification. By attempting to build a theory that explained both subconscious impulses and observable actions, they managed to unify and frustrate two halves of the psychological world. But that was also logical. However, Miller's greatest impact came from his radical challenge to the dogma that the autonomic nervous system, the system that controls heart rate, digestion, and other involuntary functions, was immune to learning. No, Miller said. He proposed that we might be able to condition these responses. The idea was met with polite skepticism, incredulous looks, and, in some circles, with open laughter. And then he demonstrated it in a series of experiments, now famous, conducted during the 50s and 60s. Miller trained rats to control internal bodily processes such as heart rate and blood pressure through reinforcement. Lower blood pressure. Get a reward. Adjust your heart rate. More treats. This was considered outside the scope of learning. And yet there were the rats doing yoga. Basically, these studies helped found the field of biofeedback, a method in which people learn to control physiological functions using real-time data. This triggered a movement that went beyond psychology and reached medicine and holistic health, from stress reduction to chronic pain and migraines. Biofeedback is now a common practice in therapeutic settings. Miller turned skeptics into believers and autonomous processes into something surprisingly trainable. But Miller did not stop at conditioning. He delved into the neurobiology of motivation, working with electrodes implanted in the brains of animals to explore the mechanisms of drive and reward. If B.F. Skinner taught us how behavior can be shaped, Miller showed us how it can be biologically driven, to the point of identifying the neural circuits that are activated when a rat reaches a lever. He explored the concept of the approach-avoidance conflict, investigating how animals and human beings navigate between the attraction and rejection of reward and risk. To want the cheese, but to fear the charge, to desire the cookie, but to fear the guilt. Miller quantified this tension and even developed mathematical models to describe the motivational conflict, which laid the foundations for later studies on decision-making and behavioral economics. His work earned him great respect. He received the National Medal of Science in 1964. In 1969, he became one of the first psychologists elected to the National Academy of Sciences. And in 1970, he was president of the American Psychological Association. Despite everything, he remained meticulous, curious, and collaborative. Miller was also concerned with the role of psychology in society. He firmly believed in using behavioral science to improve human well-being. He wrote about applying psychological principles to real-world problems such as addiction, health-related behaviors, and even more. He believed that science should serve people, not just satisfy curiosity. His colleagues described him as precise but kind, rigorous, yet never rigid. He trained a generation of scientists who continued his commitment to interdisciplinary research and human improvement. His laboratory became a center of innovative ideas, a place where neuroscience joined learning theory and where a lever could resonate in behavioral medicine's future. Neil E. Miller passed away in 2002 at 92 years old. He worked until the end, continuing to think, publish, and ask important but uncomfortable questions. His legacy endures not only in psychology textbooks, but also in hospital recovery rooms, in wellness clinics, and in all the smartwatches that vibrate when your heart rate accelerates. So tonight, when you lie quietly in bed, feel your breathing slow and your body relax. Remember, you are not just falling asleep. You are participating in one of the most exquisite biological behaviors that we know. And thanks to Neil E. Miller, we now know it a little better. Sleep well, dear dreamer. And if your pulse slows as you fall asleep, give a little nod to the man who taught us that even the automatic can be swayed. Albert Bandura, the man who told us that learning does not require shocks, bribes, or food bribes. Just a good role model and perhaps a clown doll. So, fluff your pillow and get ready to observe, retain, and relax. Once upon a time, in 1925, in the quiet town of Mundar, Alberta, Canada, a boy named Albert Bandura was born. He was the youngest of 6 children in a small farming town with a single school and a library about the size of a closet. Young Albert grew up with determination, curiosity, and a steady diet of figure out yourself. He attributed his early independence to his education in a small town. When you don't have many teachers, you learn by yourself. When you don't have ready-made answers, you learn to ask better questions. And what was he asking? Bandura earned his bachelor's degree from the University of British Columbia almost by accident, as he filled a gap in his schedule with a psychology class. Later, he earned his doctorate from the University of Iowa, the cradle of the powerful legacy of behaviorism. But Bandura was not satisfied with the traditional stimulus-response mechanism of Skinner and Watson. He was interested in what was happening inside the head, not just what was going in and out. In the 1960s, Bandura launched an experiment that would change psychology forever. He took a group of preschoolers, a room full of toys, and an inflatable clown. Thus, the Bobo doll experiment was born. This is what happened. Bandura and his colleagues took groups of preschoolers to a control playroom. Some of the children were shown a video or live demonstration of an adult behaving aggressively towards a large inflatable doll named Bobo, which he hit, kicked, hit with a mallet, and shouted at with surprisingly hostile language. Other children saw an adult playing quietly and ignoring the doll, or were given no model to observe. After watching the demonstration or not, the children were taken to a playroom with the same Bobo doll and various toys. Some aggressive mallets, toy guns, other neutral tea sets, crayons. Then the researchers observed what the children did. The result was that children who had witnessed aggressive models were significantly more likely to imitate violent behavior, some with remarkable precision. They hit, kicked, and shouted at the doll just as the adult had. Some even invented new forms of aggression beyond what had been shown. On the contrary, children who saw the non-aggressive model or no model showed much less aggressiveness. The study dramatically illustrated the idea of learning by observation. The idea that children do not need direct reinforcement to learn a behavior. They only need to see someone else do it first. The conclusion of Bandura, learning by observation, is powerful. We don't just learn by doing. We learn by observing. And not only actions, but also attitudes, consequences, and social norms. The implications were enormous. Children absorb what they see. The media matters, role models matter, parenting matters, and behavior isn't just about reinforcement. It is also about cognition and culture. This idea was a blow to behaviorism. While Skinner saw people as passive responders to stimuli, Bandura saw active agents who made decisions, interpreted signals, and shaped their own destiny. He called this vision social cognitive theory, a model that emphasized learning through observation, imitation, and internal processing. And then there was self-efficacy. Oh, glorious self-efficacy. Bandura's term to refer to a person's belief in their ability to succeed in certain situations. It's not just about what you can do, but what you think you're able to do. And it turns out that belief is a good indicator of whether you'll even try. High self-efficacy leads to persistence, resilience, and achievement. Low self-efficacy welcomes procrastination and evasion. Bandura showed that this belief influenced everything from academic performance to quitting smoking or facing phobias. It's basically the psychological version of a superpower. But Bandura was not just a theorist in a lab coat. He addressed real-world problems. Aggressiveness, addiction, phobias, the media. He developed guided mastery. He helped people overcome their fears by gradually increasing their confidence through model behavior. Are you afraid of snakes? Watch someone handle one and then try it step by step, even if you tremble. Your belief grows, and, in the end, you're the one who models. Throughout his career, Bandura remained passionate, humble, and with prodigious mental acuity. He spent more than 6 decades at Stanford University training generations of psychologists and building a research legacy that influenced education, health, the media, and public policies. He received countless awards, including the National Medal of Science, and was named one of the most cited psychologists of all time, on a par with Freud, Skinner, and Piaget. Not bad for a boy from a rural area of Canada who in summer repaired roads to pay for his studies. Albert Bandura passed away in 2021 at the age of 95, leaving behind a work that has shaped not only psychology, but also our way of thinking. His legacy lives on in classrooms, therapy consultations, parenting books, and every moment someone observes, learns, and dares to try something. So tonight, as you rest quietly in your own environment, following your routine to go to sleep, take comfort in Bandura's lesson. You don't have to be perfect to grow. You just have to see it, believe it, and take the next small step. Sleep well, and remember that there is always someone learning from you, especially when you don't even realize it. Edward Lee Thorndike, the man who put cats in boxes and, in the process, helped shape the modern theory of learning. So get comfortable and get ready to purr with some ideas inspired by puzzle boxes. Once upon a time, in 1874, in Williamsburg, Massachusetts, a boy named Edward Thorndike was born. Little Edward was intelligent, curious, and the kind of child who probably organized his toys alphabetically. He had a gift for patterns, puzzles, and asking the kind of questions that make teachers stop and say, "Let me think about it." He studied at Wesleyan University and then went to Harvard, where he studied with the legendary William James, the philosopher and psychologist who believed that the truth could be proven through experience. The warm philosophical tutoring of James planted a seed in the mind of Thorndike. Psychology could be scientific, but it did not need to be abstract. It could be real, observable, and even practical, especially if cats were involved. Thorndike's postgraduate studies took him to Columbia University, where he carried out his most famous experiments. He was not interested in dreamy introspection or dissecting old Latin texts. He was interested in learning the how, the when, and above all, the why. So he built puzzle boxes. They were simple wooden boxes equipped with levers, latches, and ropes. He put hungry cats inside and placed food just outside. The cats meowed, writhed, scratched, and eventually figured out the trick to open the door. But here is the genius. With each successive attempt, the cats became quicker. They remembered what worked and discarded what did not. From this, Thorndike formulated his greatest discovery, the law of effect. If a behavior leads to a satisfactory result, it is more likely to happen again. If it leads to discomfort or nothing, it will disappear. In a sense, it was Darwin's natural selection applied to behavior. Thorndike's work laid the foundation for instrumental learning, a form of learning based on consequences. Unlike Pavlov's dogs, who reflexively salivated at a bell, Thorndike's cats had to do something. It was a behavior that required effort and learning, a distinction that would be repeated throughout the development of operant conditioning, popularized decades later by B. F. Skinner. But Thorndike was not just an animal psychologist. He had his sights set on a much broader picture: education. He believed that understanding learning would revolutionize teaching. Memorization for memorization was over. Thorndike emphasized the importance of feedback, repetition, and relevance. He argued that teachers should know how learning really worked through the gradual strengthening of connections between stimulus and response. He wrote extensively about educational psychology, becoming one of the founding figures of this field. He developed some of the first standardized tests to measure reasoning, reading, vocabulary, and math skills. He created scales to assess handwriting and even established correlations between intelligence and success in life long before longitudinal studies became widespread. Thorndike was especially fascinated by the transfer of learning, the idea that what is learned in one context could help in another. Many assumed that this transfer was automatic. If you learn Latin, you will naturally improve in logical reasoning. Thorndike tested that assumption and said it was not that fast. His research showed that transfer only occurs when new and old tasks share elements. In other words, knowledge does not always travel. It needs a passport. He also proposed the idea that learning is incremental, not sudden. While the rest of the world marveled at moments of inspiration and flashes of genius, Thorndike quietly insisted that most learning is slow, steady, and based on repetition. Mastery is not lightning. It is a ladder. Thorndike's research extended to applied fields. He worked with the U.S. Army during World War I to develop intelligence tests for soldiers. He was a consultant in the development of curricula. He advised educators on teaching techniques. He wanted psychology to be useful, not a theory on a shelf, but a toolbox for real life. He was president of the American Psychological Association in 1912 and published hundreds of articles and books. His influence extended across generations, shaping how schools evaluate, how teachers teach, and how psychologists think about learning. He was not flashy. He did not invent Freudian drama or stage machines. But Thorndike contributed something more: clarity. He believed that behavior could be measured, predicted, and improved. He helped psychology move from philosophy to empiricism, from curiosity to method. He retired in the 1930s, but continued writing until his final years. When he passed away in 1949, he left behind more than data. He left a legacy of curiosity, rigor, and an unwavering belief that learning was an art worth understanding. So tonight, as you lie in your cozy little box, hopefully not trapped, think of Edward Thorndike and his cats. He taught us that learning does not always come in flashes. Sometimes it comes in silent attempts with clumsy legs and flickering light bulbs. But with patience, effort, and a little fish outside, the door always opens. Sleep well, my dear dreamer, and may your dreams be full of satisfactory consequences. Abraham Maslow, a man who believed that inside each of us is a hierarchy of dreams, and at the top, a panoramic view of our potential. Raise your metaphorical pyramid, take a deep breath, and let's climb one need at a time. Once upon a time, in 1908, in Brooklyn, New York, a boy named Abraham Harold Maslow was born. Maslow, the eldest of 7 children of Russian, Jewish immigrant parents, had a childhood that was far from idyllic. His father was often absent and drank heavily. His mother, according to Maslow, was cold, superstitious, and frankly cruel. He once described her as so negligent that he saw her beat a stray cat to death in front of him. So, naturally, Maslow decided to dedicate his life to understanding what makes human beings not only survive but thrive. After a difficult start at law school, his father's idea, not his, Maslow found his way to the University of Wisconsin, where he studied psychology and worked with Harry Harlow, famous for separating baby monkeys from their mothers. But while Harlow was dedicated to exploring attachment through deprivation, Maslow had his sights set on something else: fullness, love, and hope. He wanted to know how people felt complete. He completed his doctorate in Columbia with Edward Thorndike, dabbling in learning theory, but soon broke with the dominant schools of thought. Behaviorists like B.F. Skinner were obsessed with rats and reinforcement. Psychoanalysts were obsessed with childhood traumas and unconscious impulses. Maslow looked around and said, "Sure, people have problems, but what about potential?" And so, humanistic psychology was born. It wasn't just about treating dysfunction. It was about cultivating growth. Maslow wanted to study people who function well, even thrived. What makes someone creative, resilient, and compassionate? What leads to joy? His approach was not based on control or correction. It was based on encouragement, trust, and possibility. At the heart of his theory was his famous hierarchy of needs, a model of motivation structured as a pyramid in which each level represents a category of human needs. According to Maslow, we move upwards as the levels are satisfied. Physiological needs. They're the basics: food, water, oxygen, and sleep. Without them, nothing else matters. They're the basis of existence. Safety needs. Personal safety, health, stable employment. We yearn for predictability and protection from chaos. Love and belonging. Friends, family, intimacy, and community. We are programmed to connect. Isolation can be as painful as physical hunger. Esteem needs require respect from others and ourselves. Trust, achievements, and a need to feel we matter. Self-realization, the top of the pyramid. Becoming all that one is capable of being. Not perfect, but authentic, creative, ethical with purpose. Later, Maslow added another level: transcendence, which goes beyond personal fulfillment to serve something bigger. Humanity, nature, the cosmos, spiritual connection, altruism, the realm of saints, artists, and visionaries. Maslow was also fascinated by what he called peak experiences. It is not about normal happy moments or bursts of emotion. They are rare, transcendental episodes in which a person feels deeply connected to the world, to others, and to themselves in a profound, spiritual way. In those moments, time seems to stop. The ego, the sense of self, fades into the background. A person may feel awe, clarity, a sense of unity with the universe, or an overwhelming wave of gratitude. Climbing a mountain and watching the sunrise. Holding a newborn baby for the first time. Listening to a symphony that moves one to tears. Or even having a moment of intuition under a starry sky. All are potentially peak experiences. Maslow did not see these moments as random, but as flashes of the full realization of one's potential. He believed that studying and honoring these moments could teach us about the conditions that foster psychological health, creativity, love, and purpose. He realized that self-actualized people, a term he used to refer to those who constantly lived at the top of the pyramid, shared certain characteristics: autonomy, acceptance, spontaneity, need for privacy, focus on problem-solving rather than personal dramas, and a deep appreciation for life. They were able to enjoy simple things like the scent of rain, the curve of a smile, or a perfectly toasted bagel. He also wrote about being values or B-values, qualities such as truth, beauty, justice, simplicity, and joy. These values are not about survival. They are about flourishing. They give color, depth, and dignity to life. For Maslow, a full life was not only productive, but meaningful. Maslow's work had a far-reaching impact. He helped found the third force in psychology, a movement that included Carl Rogers and Rollo May, and that differed from both behaviorism and psychoanalysis. Humanistic psychology emphasized the goodness of people, the importance of free will, and the innate drive toward growth. At the University of Brandeis, Maslow was a beloved, though somewhat introverted professor. He wrote books such as Toward a Psychology of Being and Motivation and Personality, which not only offered theories, but also an invitation to imagine what we could become if we felt safe, connected, and inspired. His ideas reached education, student-centered learning, business, employee empowerment, therapy, positive growth, and even advertising. Less noble, but undeniably effective. Everyone wanted to climb the pyramid. Everyone wanted self-realization with a little yoga and artisanal coffee. Although he passed away in 1970 at the age of 62, Maslow's influence has only grown. Today, his pyramid is iconic, although people don't always give him credit when they share it on Instagram. His work inspired the birth of positive psychology, the study of happiness, strength, and resilience. He reminded us that psychology is not just about healing pain. It is also about cultivating joy. So tonight, when you lie in bed, perhaps with a roof over your head, a full stomach, and someone you love nearby, keep in mind that you are halfway up the pyramid. And even if you're still working on one level or another, it's okay. Growth is not linear. It is lived. Sleep well, my sweet dreamer. And remember, you are enough. You are growing, and your dreams are valid, especially the literal ones you are about to have. Gordon Willard Allport, the man who believed that people were more than a set of behaviors, and that personality deserved dignity, depth, and a bit of curiosity. So relax, breathe, and get ready to meet the pioneer of personality psychology. Once upon a time, in 1897, in Montezuma, Indiana, a boy named Gordon Allport was born. Gordon, the youngest of 4 siblings, grew up in a home imbued with intellect, self-discipline, and medicine. His father, a rural doctor, ran a community clinic in his house. That early exposure to people's stories, struggles, and temperaments would stay with Gordon throughout his life. Allport was not a bright student, but he was intelligent, meticulous, and drawn to big questions about individuality. After earning his undergraduate degree at Harvard, he left for Vienna to meet Sigmund Freud. The meeting proved disappointing. The young Allport described an uncomfortable session in which Freud overanalyzed a casual anecdote Gordon shared. Allport left the room thinking, surely psychology can do better than this. And so he did. Back at Harvard, he earned his doctorate and embarked on what would become a lifelong quest to understand the uniqueness of the individual. Not the average, nor the abnormal, nor the laboratory rats, but the person. At a time when psychology was obsessed with behaviorism or unconscious impulses, Allport insisted that people were motivated by conscious values, goals, and aspirations. He did not reject biology or conditioning. He simply thought they weren't everything. His landmark 1937 book, Personality, A Psychological Interpretation, helped establish personality psychology as an independent discipline. In it, he laid out a vision of the individual as a complex, dynamic being deeply motivated by both their past experiences and future ideals. He also established a distinction between nomothetic approaches, which seek general laws about people, and idiographic approaches, which focus on the uniqueness of each person. Allport, always an individualist, defended the latter. He introduced the idea of traits as basic components of personality. But not all traits were created equal. He described 3 levels. Cardinal traits. They are powerful and uncommon traits so deeply rooted in an individual's identity that they influence almost everything they do. They become a defining force in that person's life. Think about how compassion framed Mother Teresa's entire mission, or how the pursuit of knowledge shaped each of her actions and curiosity about knowledge. Few people have a true cardinal trait, but those who do are often remembered for that singular quality. Central traits. They are the fundamental attributes that form the basis of your personality. They are not as all-consuming as cardinal traits, but they constantly influence your thoughts, behaviors, and how others perceive you. Central traits are what you would use to describe a close friend. Kind, intelligent, stubborn, loyal. They are the key threads of the tapestry of your behavior. Secondary traits. They are traits that surface only in certain contexts or under specific conditions. They are preferences, attitudes, or quirks that do not define who you are in all situations. Perhaps you are normally quiet, but very competitive in board games. Maybe you hate country music but love Taylor Swift. These traits add nuance, flavor, and variability to your personality without completely dominating it. This trait theory influenced almost all personality models that followed, from the Big Five to the MBTI. The Big Five, also known as the five-factor model, proposes 5 general dimensions of personality: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. It is widely accepted in modern psychology for its empirical validity and cross-cultural relevance. On the other hand, the MBTI, Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, is based on the theories of Carl Jung and classifies people into 16 personality types based on 4 dichotomies. For example, introversion versus extroversion, thinking versus feeling. Although very popular in the business and personal development field, the MBTI is more controversial in academic psychology. Even so, both systems owe the conceptual debt to Allport's pioneering work in identifying and organizing personality traits. It was Allport who, for the first time, took the chaos of human personality and began classifying it into a useful, understandable system. But he was interested in more than traits. He was deeply concerned with prejudices. His 1954 book, The Nature of Prejudice, is still considered one of the most important works of social psychology. Based on research, observation, and his moral compass, Allport explored how stereotypes form, how contact between groups can reduce prejudice, and why empathy is a powerful antidote to hatred. He also developed the contact hypothesis, the idea that interaction between groups can reduce prejudice under the right conditions. This became the basis for civil rights era policy and later diversity and inclusion programs worldwide. Allport believed religion, culture, and personal values were fundamental to defining who we are, not mere footnotes to biology or habits. He argued that mature faith based on compassion and reflection differed greatly from rigid dogma. He wanted psychology to be human, not mechanical. His approach was deeply integrative. Biology, social influence, personal narrative, and moral development all had a place. He believed in functional autonomy, the idea that even if a behavior started for a reason, for example, studying to please parents, it could become its own source of meaning over time. Studying because you like learning. Motivation, he insisted, evolves. At Harvard, Allport was a beloved professor and mentor. He taught one of the first courses on personality in the United States and supervised a young student named Thomas Pettigrew, who later became a civil rights scholar. Allport himself was known for his principles, his respect, and his warmth. A man who practiced what he preached. Despite his gentleness, he was unafraid to challenge the status quo. He denounced reductionism. He opposed racism and anti-Semitism. He believed science should elevate our understanding of humanity, not flatten it. Gordon Allport passed away in 1967, leaving behind work that made psychology more human, thoughtful, and concerned with the dignity of the person. So tonight, as you prepare to immerse yourself in your dreams, remember you are more than your past, your habits, or your data. You are a complex constellation of values, traits, and purposes, just as everyone liked the port. Sleep well, dear dreamer, and may your fundamental traits gently guide you through night. Carl Jung, the man who turned dreams into maps, symbols into truths, and the unconscious into a lifelong adventure. So take a deep breath and prepare to descend into the collective unconscious. Once upon a time, in 1875, in the quiet Swiss town of Casswil, a baby named Carl Gustav Jung was born into a family divided by religion and the inexplicable. His father was a Protestant pastor who struggled with doubt. His mother, more inclined to the spiritual, claimed communication with the dead. Jung grew up fascinated by the invisible forces at work in the world, forces that would later become the basis for one of the most profound psychological systems ever created. As a child, Jung was lonely and thoughtful. He preferred books and dreams to sports and crowds. He imagined that he had 2 selves. One, a school-age child living in the present. The other, a dignified old man from a previous century. That strange feeling of double identity tormented him, but also guided his curiosity toward the deepest layers of consciousness. It was not just imagination. It was the beginning of analytical psychology. After studying medicine and psychiatry at the University of Basel and working at the Berg-Holtzley Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, Jung became a rising star in psychiatry. It was there that he met Sigmund Freud, the man whose work he would first defend and then question. Their initial friendship was passionate. They met in 1907 and talked for 13 hours straight. Freud saw Jung as his intellectual heir. Jung saw Freud as a mentor, perhaps even a father figure, but that did not last. Freud was convinced that sexuality was the root of all psychological conflicts. Jung was not convinced. He considered spirituality, myths, and symbols as equally important. The unconscious, he argued, was not just a dark well of repressed desires. It was a vast, structured domain containing both personal and collective contents. Their breakup was painful, yet inevitable. Jung followed his own path and spent years in what he later called a creative illness, a deep inner descent into the unconscious that gave rise to the foundations of his theories. Jung's map of the mind included many familiar elements, such as the ego and conscious mind. But what differentiated him was his emphasis on what lay beneath the surface. The personal unconscious, containing forgotten memories and repressed experiences unique to each individual. And, more radically, the collective unconscious, a deeper layer shared by all humanity. Jung believed that this collective unconscious contained universal patterns and motifs, which he called archetypes. Archetypes are not learned behaviors or specific memories, but innate psychological structures, primary blueprints of experience and behavior. They appear throughout time and across all cultures, often in myths, dreams, and stories. Among them are figures such as the hero, who embodies courage and the journey toward transformation, the mother, who symbolizes care and creation, the shadow, which houses the darkest aspects of the psyche that we try to ignore or repress, the wise old man, who represents wisdom and guidance, and the trickster, who breaks rules and provokes change through chaos and humor. According to Jung, these characters emerge from the collective unconscious and help us make sense of our inner life and the world around us. They are not taught. They are remembered as if engraved in our being. Jung also introduced the concept of the persona, the social mask we wear to meet the expectations of others. It is how we present ourselves to the world. And although it is necessary to function in social life, it can become limiting if we begin to believe that the mask is all we are. Behind the persona lies the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we have disowned, rejected, or buried. It includes impulses, emotions, and traits that we have deemed unacceptable. Jung believed that true growth requires facing the shadow, not to destroy it, but to understand and integrate it. Only by recognizing the entire spectrum of who we are, both light and darkness, can we become whole. Jung called this lifelong integration process individuation. It is the psychological journey that consists of uniting the conscious with the unconscious, aligning with the deepest self, and becoming truly authentic. For Jung, this was not just therapy. It was the purpose of life, to become who you truly are. For Jung, therapy was not limited to the relief of symptoms. It was a sacred journey toward wholeness. Dreams were messages from the unconscious, rich with metaphors and meaning. He encouraged his patients to write down their dreams, paint their symbols, and walk the inner path. And yes, he believed in synchronicity, the idea that meaningful coincidences do not occur by cause and effect, but from an underlying unity between mind and matter. If you dream of a raven and then see one perched on your window, Jung would not consider it coincidence. He would consider it meaningful. He also gave us the concepts of introversion and extroversion, two basic orientations of the psyche. Introverts turn inward toward thoughts and reflection. Extroverts turn outward toward people and activity. These terms were later adapted by Isabel Briggs Myers in the MBTI, one of the most used personality tools worldwide today. Jung's creativity was not limited to lectures. He wrote obsessively, explored alchemy as a metaphor for psychological transformation, and even built a personal refuge called the Bollingen Tower, where he carved inscriptions in Latin and meditated by the lake. His life was a fusion of science, art, mysticism, and profound psychological vision. In his later years, Jung continued writing and teaching, becoming a silent sage in the psychological world. His complete works fill more than 20 volumes. The Red Book, published posthumously, offered an intimate vision of his own symbolic explorations, an exuberant illustrated journey into his inner world. He died in 1961, but Jung's impact only deepened. His work resonates not only among psychologists, but also among artists, philosophers, filmmakers, theologians, and anyone who dares to explore the inner frontiers. He taught us that healing does not come from repression, but rather from integration. That the monsters in our dreams can be guides in disguise. And that wholeness is not perfection, but acceptance. So tonight, when you fall asleep, let the world of dreams gently unfold before you. Whether you meet a hero, a shadow, a wise old man, or a talking fox, don't dismiss them. Ask him what he has to teach you. Jung believed that the psyche speaks in symbols and that it is always trying to take you to a deeper, truer place. Sleep well, my dear dreamer, and may your dreams be filled with the meaning of mandalas and the quiet invitation to know yourself fully. Erik Erikson, the man who traced the human journey as a series of crises that do not break us, but build us. So get comfortable and let's walk together through the stages of a life well lived. Once upon a time, in 1902, in Frankfurt, Germany, a child was born under uncertain circumstances. His name was Erik Salomonson, at least in the beginning. He never met his biological father. His mother remarried a doctor named Theodor Hamburger, and Erik took his last name. It's not hamburger, by the way, but if his last name makes you want a midnight snack, I understand perfectly. Later, in a gesture of profound self-definition and perhaps with a touch of extravagance, he renamed himself Erik Erikson. That's right, Erik, son of Erik. If that sounds like something a Nordic god might say in a Viking baptism ceremony, you're not far off. Identity, you see, was always fundamental. Growing up, Erik felt like a stranger. He was tall, blonde, and blue-eyed in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. And yet, he was Jewish by upbringing. At school, he was teased for being different. In the synagogue, he also stood out. This tension between belonging and estrangement, roots and reinvention, would define much of his personal and intellectual life. He studied art in his youth, wandering around Europe in search of a purpose, a meaning, and from time to time, a good angle for drawing. Finally, he stumbled upon psychoanalysis, first as a patient and then as a student of Anna Freud, Sigmund's brilliant daughter. His artistic eye and his empathetic spirit made him an unusually intuitive thinker. He never obtained a traditional medical degree, but he would become one of the most influential developmental psychologists of the 20th century. Erikson's great contribution was a theory of psychosocial development that expanded Freud's work beyond childhood and encompassed the entire arc of life. Where Freud saw psychosexual stages, Erikson saw crises, turning points, dilemmas, and opportunities. And unlike Freud, who stopped in adolescence, Erikson took us until old age. His model consists of 8 stages, each with a central challenge, each shaping the next. 1. Trust versus mistrust. Childhood. Can I trust the world? If caregivers are consistent and caring, the child learns that life is safe and that people are trustworthy. If not, the seeds of mistrust are sown. 2. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. Early childhood. Can I do things myself? Young children test limits. Walking, choosing, saying no. Stimulus encourages independence. Criticism generates doubt. 3. Initiative versus guilt. The preschool stage. Can I take initiative and lead? Here, children begin to plan, imagine, and initiate play. Supported exploration fosters confidence. Excessive control fosters guilt. 4. Industriousness versus inferiority. Primary school. Can I achieve things and feel competent? School introduces tasks, teamwork, and feedback. Success leads to a sense of capability. Failure can sow seeds of inadequacy. 5. Identity versus role. Confusion. Adolescence. Who am I? The most famous stage of Erickson's. Adolescents struggle with values, roles, and identities. A firm identity brings clarity. Confusion can lead to drift. 6. Intimacy versus isolation. Early adulthood. Can I form lasting, deep relationships? Emotional vulnerability, commitment, and shared life paths are put to the test here. Isolation can follow fear or evasion. 7. Generativity versus stagnation. Middle adulthood. Can I give something back? Raising children, guiding others, building community. Generativity is the legacy. Without it, one can feel stagnant or dissatisfied. 8. Integrity versus despair. Late adulthood. Has my life had meaning? The final balance. Those who see their lives as coherent and valuable find peace. Those who see only remorse can fall into despair. Erickson's model offered something radical for its time. The idea that human development continues throughout life, that we are always evolving, always facing new tensions, and always able to grow. He wrote wonderfully about these ideas, especially in his emblematic book, Childhood and Society. He also coined the term identity crisis, which is now part of everyday language. But, in Erickson's opinion, an identity crisis was not a collapse. It was an opening, an opportunity to redefine and reorient oneself. He taught at Harvard, Yale, and the University of California at Berkeley, combining psychoanalysis with cultural anthropology, history, and philosophy. He analyzed historical figures, such as Martin Luther and Gandhi, to show how personal crises intersect cultural forces. Erickson was also an attentive observer of society. He was concerned about the impact of modern life on identity, how cruelty, the media, and rapid changes could destabilize self. But he never lost faith in our ability to adapt. He was married to Joan Erickson, a brilliant collaborator who helped him refine and expand his ideas. Together, they later proposed a ninth stage, a reflection on old age from within, in which previous conflicts resurface, but from a new perspective. Life, they said, returns to the starting point. Erickson passed away in 1994 at the age of 91. His work continues being a pillar of the psychology of the development that influences in therapists, educators, parents, and anyone that has ever wondered what will come after. So tonight, wherever you are in the timeline of life, keep in mind that your current challenge is only a stage. It is not a flaw. It is part of the journey. And with reflection, connection, and courage, you will grow. Sleep well, dear friend, and may each dream gently guide you through the story of becoming yourself. William James, philosopher, psychologist, spiritual explorer, and a man who turned the chaos of consciousness into a field of study. So lie down, breathe slowly, and prepare to follow the flow of thoughts. Once upon a time, in 1842, in New York City, a boy named William James was born into the American equivalent of an intellectual dynasty. His father, Henry James Sr., was a Swedenborgian theologian who organized salons full of philosophers and eccentrics. His brother, Henry James Jr., would become one of the greatest novelists of his time. And William James would invent American psychology between long bouts of existential angst. James was a restless soul, a thinker in motion. Educated in Europe and the United States, he moved from one discipline to another like a pinball. He tried painting, too rigid, medicine, too anatomical, biology, too impersonal. He suffered crushing anxiety and depressive episodes. At one point, he considered ending his life. What brought him back? It was not a miracle or medication, but a philosophical phrase. James read the French philosopher Charles Renouvier, who wrote that free will might not be demonstrable, but choosing to believe in it could give meaning to life. At that moment, that act of faith transformed William James. It was not evidence that saved William James. It was faith. It was then that he realized that ideas are not only true or false. Believing in it could give meaning to life. At that moment, an act of faith in free will transformed him. It was not evidence that saved William James. It was belief. It was then that he realized that ideas are not only true or false, but that they are lived. He finally found his academic home at Harvard, where he began teaching physiology and psychology. In 1875, he gave what is considered the first psychology course in the United States. Even though there was no formal department or curriculum, and, as he himself later admitted, not much method either, what he did have was vision. In 1890, James published The Principles of Psychology, a 2-volume monster that tried to cover everything: the habit, the attention, the memory, the will, the emotion, the mystical states, the free will, and the soul. It is rambling, brilliant, digressive, and very, very James. He avoided reductionism. He resisted ordered definitions. He spoke like a human studying humans, not like a distant observer counting laboratory rats. His most famous metaphor, the flow of consciousness. Not a train, not a chain, but a river of thoughts that flows, always in motion, never still. He insisted that we cannot truly separate one idea from another because experience, real experience, does not come pre-divided. This idea revolutionized psychology and also directly influenced the literary style of people like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce. Then there was his theory of emotions. Most people think that I cry because I am sad. James reversed it. I cry, therefore I am sad. The body acts and the mind interprets. Feelings are the way in which we interpret our physiological states. He was radical, and he remains so. But James was not satisfied with just laboratory psychology. He wanted to understand the whole range of human experience, even the spiritual. His work, The Varieties of Religious Experience, remains one of the most beloved books in both psychology and philosophy. In it, he explored mystical states, sudden conversions, deep faith, and the strange serenity of the saints, not to demonstrate or refute the existence of God, but to honor what belief does for a person. He did not see religious experiences as delusions, but as transformative truths, valid because they change the life of the believer. His idea of pragmatism developed together with Charles Sanders Peirce, who judged ideas not by their logic, but by their consequences. What works stays. What helps matters. It was an American philosophy, skeptical of dogma, deeply personal, and based on action. James was also an attentive observer of habits. He wrote that our lives are shaped by the habits we create. Do you want to change your life? Start by changing small ones. This simple idea became the basis of behavioral science, psychotherapy, and even modern self-help. He was charismatic, kind, sometimes scattered, always curious. He could debate with philosophers, inspire students, and write passages that today are still as current as in the 19th century. He believed in psychology with a soul, not as a science of rats and levers, but of human beings who create meaning. His last years were full of writing, reflection, and travel. He suffered from heart problems, but remained active almost until the end. He maintained correspondence with thinkers such as Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud, and even Leo Tolstoy. He was revered not only for his intellect, but also for his humanity. When he died in 1910, William James left more than books. He left a way of thinking, a voice that continues to resonate in classrooms, therapy consultations, meditation circles, and spiritual retreats. He taught us that thought is fluid, that beliefs matter, that experience is sacred. So tonight, when your own stream of consciousness begins to calm down, let it wander wherever it wants. William James would tell you not to force it. Let it flow. Observe it, feel it, respect it, and keep in mind that, in doing so, you are participating in the greatest study of all, the science of a human being. Sleep well, dear dreamer, and may your dreams gently carry you down the river, where thought meets peace and feelings take shape. Hans-Jürgen Eysenck, the man who tried to reduce human personality to a few dimensions and unleashed decades of debate in the process. So relax, breathe, and get ready to meet the behavioral scientist who quantified the psyche. Once upon a time, in 1916, in Berlin, Germany, a boy named Hans-Jürgen Eysenck was born into a family of artists. His parents were actors immersed in the arts, but Hans was drawn to a different stage, the world of science. He did not find the drama in the theater, but in the data. And when Hitler came to power, the teenager, who did not mince words on political matters, refused to join the Nazi Party and fled Germany for England in 1934. He was only 18 years old. He settled in London, studied psychology at University College London, and obtained his doctorate in 1940. Almost immediately, Eysenck established himself as a nonconformist. While others followed Freud into the depths of dreams and the unconscious, Eysenck wanted nothing to do with that. Psychoanalysis, he said, was impossible to prove, unscientific, and frankly, a bit theatrical. He believed that psychology had to mature, be more objective, and start acting like a real science. He didn't just say it out loud. He had numbers. In the 1950s, Eysenck published an article that caused an academic earthquake, a meta-analysis in which he claimed that psychotherapy, especially psychoanalysis, was no more effective than spontaneous recovery. That is, people improved at about the same rate with or without therapy. Unsurprisingly, therapists were not amused. But Eysenck didn't care. He was used to raising blisters. His mission was clarity, not popularity. His preferred weapon was factor analysis, a statistical method that allowed him to identify patterns in personality data and reduce them to fundamental traits. This led him to his most outstanding contribution, the three-factor model of personality. He began with two main dimensions: extroversion versus introversion. The classic energetic orientation. Extroverts seek stimulation, social excitement, and external commitment. Introverts tend to introspection, calm, and routine. I think he theorized that these differences reflected the levels of arousal in the brain's reticular activating system. Neuroticism versus emotional stability. This dimension captured emotional reactivity. A high level of neuroticism meant frequent anxiety, mood swings, and sensitivity to stress. Low neuroticism reflected stability and resilience. Then he added a third, psychoticism, the wild card. This referred to aggressiveness, impulsivity, and nonconformity. It correlated with creativity in some studies and antisocial behavior in others. Critics considered it poorly defined. His admirers called it a bold attempt to map complex behavior. These became the backbone of the Eysenck Personality Questionnaire, EPQ. His goal was not only to describe people, but to predict their behavior. He wanted to know how personality shaped choices, risks, careers, and even criminal tendencies. Eysenck also emphasized the biological basis of personality. He argued that traits were hereditary and reflected brain function. Introverts, he proposed, had naturally higher cortical arousal and therefore avoided additional stimulation. Extroverts needed more noise, novelty, and dopamine. He was decades ahead of neuroscience, and modern studies have largely confirmed his biological hypothesis. But he didn't stop there. Eysenck immersed himself in research on intelligence, claiming that IQ had a strong genetic component. He studied twin data, designed cognitive tests, and delved into the controversial terrain of race and intelligence. His stance that genetics explained differences in group IQ scores sparked outrage and accusations of scientific racism. Although he denied being racist, his links to controversial figures and his willingness to publish extreme opinions tarnished his legacy, and the ethical storm surrounding his work continues to this day. He was also skeptical of most clinical psychology. He considered psychotherapy ineffective without scientific support. He was a proponent of behavioral therapy, focused on conditioning, learning, and measurable outcomes. He promoted exposure therapy for phobias long before it became widespread. Throughout his 50-year career, Eysenck published more than 1,000 scientific articles and more than 70 books. He founded Personality and Individual Differences, a journal dedicated to the empirical science of personality. He trained dozens of students and sparked thousands of debates. He was part professor and part provocateur. He wasn't warm. He wasn't kind. He was not diplomatic, but he was intellectually intrepid. Eysenck retired in 1983, but continued to publish until his death in 1997. His critics never disappeared, and in 2019, King's College London began reviewing several of his articles for alleged ethical violations and possible data manipulation. The shadow over his work is real, but so is the mark he left on psychology. Today, personality psychology is a booming field. The Big Five model, now dominant, has a clear debt to Eysenck's early work on dimensional trait theory. Modern neuroscience has validated many of his ideas about biological foundations. Even his critics often rely on the questions he raised. So tonight, as you reflect on your own temperament, your quirks, habits, sensitivities, and patterns, think about Hans Eysenck. He tried to capture human nature with numbers, not to strip us of our mystery, but to study us with precision. And in doing so, he gave psychology greater precision. Sleep well, my dear dreamer, and may your dreams be balanced on the axis of curiosity and calm with just a pinch of healthy rebellion. David Mlen, the man who made motivation measurable, turned achievement into a science and quietly revolutionized our way of understanding human ambition. Take a deep breath and get ready to meet the psychologist who studied what drives us to strive. Once upon a time, in 1917, in Mount Vernon, New York, a boy named David Mlen was born into a world where psychology was still debated between Freud's couch and Skinner's levers. Little did the world know that this quiet and curious boy would grow up to chart one of the most important engines of human behavior: motivation. David Mlen's academic career was impressive, but discreet. He obtained his bachelor's degree from the University of Wesleyan, did postgraduate studies at the University of Missouri, and received his doctorate from Yale in 1941. With a brilliant mind and methodical temperament, Mlen was not looking to shake the foundations of psychology with extravagant theories. He was looking for something more subtle and perhaps even more powerful: the forces that drive us from within. In the post-war years, Mlen arrived at Harvard, where he would spend much of his career. While others focused on behavior or cognition, he focused on motivation. What makes people get out of bed drives them to compete, learn, build, lead, and achieve goals. He believed that motives were not always obvious. People didn't always know why they did what they did. To discover these hidden impulses, he turned to an unusual but revealing method: the thematic apperception test, TAT, a projective test originally developed by Henry A. Murray and Christiana D. Morgan in the 1930s. The TAT presents individuals with ambiguous images, often of people in social situations, and asks them to tell a story. Mlen did not invent the test, but he innovated its application. He developed a systematic method of coding and scoring to analyze these stories for themes related to achievement, affiliation, and power. Through this adaptation, he transformed the TAT into a powerful tool for measuring subconscious motivation. Mlen believed that these stories, when properly analyzed, could reveal the subconscious motives that guided a person's life. Mlen's use of the TAT developed his theory of human motivation, identifying three basic needs that drive human behavior: the need for achievement, the desire to excel, to succeed through one's own effort, and to meet or exceed standards. People with a high level of this need prefer moderate challenges, take personal responsibility, and crave feedback. The need for affiliation, the desire to be loved and accepted, to belong to a group, and to maintain warm and close relationships. Need for power, the desire to have influence to control or guide the course of events. It wasn't just about abstract traits. Mlen showed that these needs could predict behavior in classrooms, in businesses, and in politics. People with a strong motivation for achievement tended to be better entrepreneurs. Those driven by the desire for influence and control often thrived in leadership and management positions. For their part, people with a great need for affiliation found their strengths in teamwork, diplomacy, and positions that required establishing and maintaining close relationships. Suddenly, personality was not only descriptive, but predictive. Llewellyn's work was not limited to the academic field. He applied his research to real-world problems. In the 60s and 70s, he began working with governments and international organizations to identify and train leaders in developing countries. He developed assessment centers and training programs designed to cultivate motivation for achievement. The goal was to boost economic growth by fostering entrepreneurship. His approach was rigorous, but refreshingly optimistic. He believed that motivation could be cultivated, not just discovered, through feedback, coaching, and goal setting. People could actually increase their motivation for achievement. This went against deterministic views that considered personality to be fixed. He also challenged the then popular IQ fetish. In his influential 1973 article, Testing for Competence Rather Than for Intelligence, Llewellyn argued that standardized intelligence tests were poor predictors of job performance. What mattered most, he said, were the competencies, the specific traits, motivations, and behaviors linked to success in a given role. This idea, radical at that time, led directly to the modern field of human resources based on competences. Nowadays, companies around the world hire, train, and evaluate based on behavioral competences, a framework rooted in the work of Llewellyn. He was co-founder of McBurn & Company, which later became part of the Hay Group, a consulting firm that translated his research into practical business tools. Through this work, his influence extended to executive development, educational reform, and even military training. If you have ever done a leadership assessment at work, Llewellyn is somewhere in your DNA. And yet, despite his enormous impact, Llewellyn remained relatively unknown. He was not a famous professor or a source of witty phrases. He was a craftsman of theory and application. His work was meticulous, measured, and quietly revolutionary. He retired from Harvard in 1987, but continued to work as a consultant and mentor. He passed away in 1998, leaving a model of motivation that is still taught, tested, and used in leadership development programs around the world. He taught us that ambition is not a valid engine for everyone, that what moves us is as individual as a fingerprint, but measurable as a heartbeat. So tonight, as you lie down, think about what drives you. Is it the emotion of mastering something, the warmth of relationships, or the need to influence? Whatever it is, be sure that David Llewellyn would not see it as a label, but a starting point. May you rest, dear friends, and may your dreams be full of purpose, progress, and the silent power of inner motivation.